Look at that. The attendees just pouring into this meeting. Great. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to call into today's member hour featuring Bob Quinn. We'll just maybe give it, where I see we're right at the top of the hour. We'll maybe give it just 20 more seconds for stragglers to come in, and then we'll kick it off. Okay, 10:01. Bob, I know your plate is full here, so we'll go ahead and get started. So first off, attendees, thank you everybody for calling into this virtual member hour for ASABE. Today, the highlight is Regenerative Organic Farming and the Future of Agriculture featuring Bob Quinn. Just a reminder, this presentation is being recorded for on-demand playback later in the ASABE library. I would ask if you can, just to turn on your video so Bob's got an audience to speak to rather than a bunch of black boxes with names on it. That's merely a courtesy recommendation here, but if you're listening, driving, etc., that's okay too. I won't hold it against you. I am going to drop in the chat a link to YouTube. This is the library for previous member hour videos and sessions that we've recorded. If you're interested in going back, you like the content you see here, you can always go back and listen to any one of those on demand later. But like I said, I'm going to turn it over to Bob Quinn in a minute, but Bob Quinn is a distinguished researcher and fourth generation farmer that has spent his last 40 years farming in Big Sandy, Montana. Bob's 4,000 acre Century Farm has been 100% organic for the past 30 years. And Bob has actually been instrumental in the establishment and growth of organics in the United States. His value-added approach to agriculture has created opportunities far beyond his own farm, as you will learn more here today. If you like and you want to spend more time on this topic than just the hour today, Bob and Liz Carlise have recently published a book, Grain by Grain. And I've read it. It's a really good book. It talks a lot about what Bob's going to talk about here today, more in depth. So just a plug for that. And with that, Bob, I'm going to turn it over to you. And again, thank you for taking the time with us today.
Well, thanks very much, Jason. It's a great honor to be here, and welcome to all the attendees from wherever you're at, all over the world, I guess. And we'll just take off. I'm going to. Jason's running my slides, so I'll have to give him the nod. There you go. Yeah, go ahead. Give us the welcome from Big Sandy. Well, go back to that first one. I was going to show you where we live. Those are the Bear Paw Mountains. We're between those and the Missouri River in Montana. I'll show you a map in a second. But it's the northern Great Plains and the short grass prairies. You can see the prairie behind the combine there. We're cutting wheat, but we're right on the edge of grasslands. So we're wheat and cattle country primarily. That's why I was raised at. I'll give you a little history because most of what I have learned is, or the ideas I've come to and the philosophies I've come to is from my experiences. So I'm going to share a little of those with you to give you an idea of how I arrived at the conclusions that I have. And then we'll hopefully have a few minutes at the end to talk about some of those if you have some questions. So go ahead and we'll have a welcome from Big Sandy. This is our hometown. My hometown, it's 600 people. And that's Main Street. It's 2 whole blocks long. And so I'm going to tell a little bit about where I've been, because I think to know where you're headed, you have to know where you've been, and you have to understand where you came from. So this is my story that I'm going to go over with you real quick. I started in Big Sandy, or our family did, and Jason should show the next one, and we'll go. Oh, this is the map. I'm sorry. We're in north central Montana, so the west of Montana is mostly mountains, and the east, about from the Shelby, where you see Great Falls, is all prairie. So that's where we are, near the Missouri River. And my great grandfather came here. If we can get the next slide, Jason, please, in 1919. And this is a picture of his thrashing crew. There's about 15 men that was required to run that thrashing crew. And they went from farm to farm, thrashing out the grain that had been bound and shocked and then hauled in during harvest time. So that was a big project in those days. And the next picture shows my grandfather, who started our farm in 1920, and he farmed to 1948. And he started out with 320 acres, and he got a pull-type combine in 1926. And now from 15, the harvest crew is down to about 3, one on the truck and or the wagon hauling the grain away, and then the tractor and the one on the combine. So that was a big improvement. When my dad came back to the farm in 1948, he ended up with a self-propelled combine, and he thought he was cutting the fat hog with that. And he got the farm up to about 2,400 acres. We were half crop land, half pasture, and that was about the average size farm for Montana. In those days, it hasn't changed too much now. But a self-propelled combine, my sister and I were the truck drivers, so there still were only 3 were running the harvest crew, and he was one of the first to introduce ag chemicals in the 1950s, and his main goal was high yields. And then I came back to the farm in 1978, and there I am in our combine with a cab. Now I've got air conditioning and radio. Oh man, it was just wow, cats meow. I thought I was in heaven. We increased our size of our farm from about 2,400 acres to 4,000 over the next 40 years. And we changed from chemical farming to regenerative organic farming, which I'll talk about a little bit later. We did value added to the crops we had. We did specialty crops. We went from worldwide marketing to local food production. So that was that's what I'm going to tell you about. So the next slide show us my experience. I'm going to talk to you in about 3 portions. And the first portion I'm going to talk about is food and agriculture. I had 2 great loves as a youth. One was plants and the other was science. And when I went to college at Montana State University in Bozeman, I combined those 2 and studied botany and got a bachelor's in that, and then a master's in plant pathology. And then I went on to UC Davis in California and got a PhD in plant biochemistry, because I was told that that's kind of where we were in science, and we're at the biochemical level. And this was the 1970s. And that's why I went to study to see if we could solve the problems of the plants in the world. I was a little disillusioned, however, by the time I finished 10 years of college and found that most of the challenges between research laboratories was fighting over grants. And we were told not to even talk to the people and doing similar work because they were in competition for us for money. And I thought that was completely irrational and not my style, and not what I believed was necessary for cooperation and advancement of science and knowledge. It's much better than that now. It's not really that way now, but it was in those days. And so I show the next slide. We're packing up and heading home. We're going back to the family farm, leaving California in 1978. I'd been in university for 10 years. You think that would have been enough? My parents certainly thought it was enough. And I had started a small business in California and decided I didn't want to raise my family there. There was too much commotion, and Montana was looking better all the time. But I didn't come home. I came home to the farm. I didn't come home with any notion to change the food system or change anything. I thought everything was pretty good the way it was. The next slide, let's tell you what happened when we got there. With a 2,400 acre farm, it was just about the right size for one family, but it was it was a lot tight for 2. And we're trying to figure out how we're going to support ourselves with 2 families and farm the size for support 1 normally. And I didn't want to go to town and get a job, and because I had to, I wanted to come home to the farm, and I didn't want to send my wife to town to get a job because she was good help for me on the farm. And we had 3 kids. She had a full-time job anyway, or a job and a half. And so I decided to see if I could add more value to what we already raised, which was primarily high protein winter wheat. That was our main crop. And I found a baker, in Southern California that was looking for a high protein, hard red wheat that he could make into whole grain sprouted bread. And we got hooked up with him, and he paid us $1 a bushel premium for that wheat that we just cleaned and bagged it, and they paid us $1 premium over the price of the market, which was about $3 then. So that was a huge advantage and a huge income boost for us. So we were going just really great. And I thought that was going to be a great idea. Now we're selling our grain by the pound instead of by the truckload, and getting a much better deal for it. Everything was going just fine until about a year later, he called up. This is about 1983 now. In 84, he called up and he said, "Hey, Bob," he says on the phone, he said, "You think you could find some organic grain about the same kind of qualities you've been sending me of that stuff from Montana?" And I said, "Oh, well, sure, Jim. Yeah, don't worry about it. I'll have it to you in 10 days or so." And hung up the phone. And I thought, kind of slumped back in my chair, and I thought, my gosh, I don't even know any organic farmers. In fact, I didn't even believe in this organic stuff because I had been taught all my life that a plant couldn't tell the difference between a molecule of nitrogen coming out of a manure pile and one coming out of a bag of ammonium sulfate, a chemical fertilizer, for example. And so I was very skeptical of this stuff. And yet I didn't let my prejudice stand in the way of satisfying my customers' desires. So I started calling around, and I finally found a organic farmer in Montana in the northeast corner, about 300 miles from me. And I took my truck up to his place and loaded it up, brought it back. He signed an affidavit saying it was organic to suit California law. That's all we needed in those days. And we claimed it and bagged it and sent it to California. And Jim called up a few days later and he said, "Wow, this is great stuff. Can you get me another load?" And then another load and another load. And finally, I was really scouring the country to find all the organic farmers I could. And there weren't very many in those days. But they started buying me to their meetings after I started getting acquainted with them. And I ended up with a whole new group of friends. And I'd been used to going to Farm Bureau meetings and grain grower meetings. And most of the talk was, whoa, woe is us and woe is me. The prices in the toilet and the government programs aren't helping us and weather is terrible and on and on and on. And I went to this organic meeting with these friends of mine, and they didn't have, there was none of that kind of talk. They talked about how their fields were changing and that they could feel the tilth increasing as they walked over the fields. They were softer and they weren't as hard, and they were growing their own fertilizer, and they were using rotations to eliminate the need for pesticides. And I was astounded. And I thought, I went home and I said, "Dad, we got to try some of this." And because now my science background is starting to emerge and I'm getting really curious. And so I talked my dad into a 20-acre experiment that was in alfalfa. Let's see, if you go to the next slide, Jason, that I think shows, yep. So we had an alfalfa field that's about 20 acres right next to our chemical fields. And it had been in alfalfa for about 3 years. So we broke that out and planted winter wheat in 87. Or in 86, I mean, and then we harvested the next year. And it was side by side with a conventional field or a chemical field. And I put enough nitrogen on the chemical field to equal the nitrogen I found in the organic field that had been accumulated from the alfalfa. And at harvest time, we had about 33 bushel in the organic field, 33 per acre in the chemical field. The proteins were nearly identical, 15.3 compared to 16. I was astounded. I was so excited. My experiment had worked. My dad he was astounded. He was amazed. He said, here he had been spending tens of thousands of dollars every year for fertilizers and chemicals and all this stuff. And this young whippersnapper came back from California and it had equaled what he had been doing with all these inputs with no inputs at all, other than what we had grown. And I said, "Wow, Dad, look at this." I said, "Well, let's go 50% next year on the farming." "Oh, wait a minute." He says, how about 15%? And I said, "How about 20? He said, "Okay, fine, 20. So we increased our experiments the next year to about 20%. Next year we had a drought and it didn't rain. And in Montana, a lot of times when we don't have rain, we have grasshoppers. And this was no exception. We had grasshoppers were starting to move in from the pastures, and I knew what to do with my chemical fields, which were mostly the majority by then still. And I called up my buddies in town. I said, "Oh, we got grasshoppers. Oh, we'll be there in the morning." Here comes their spray plane with malathion, sprayed everything. Everything was dead within hours. And but with my organic field, I had no idea what to do. And I called up my friends and I said, "What are you doing with these grasshoppers?" And they said, "Oh, just calm down, calm down. There's a product by the name of Nosema locusta, and it's a protozoa, which is a little smaller than a bacteria. And you put it on wheat bran and you spread it around the edge of your field. And as the grasshoppers are coming in to the field from the grasses as they're drying up, they eat that and they get sick. And then all their friends come after them and they eat their buddies who are sick. It's just like politics in America today, you see. And it was very effective in spreading that disease through the whole slug of grasshoppers, and at harvest time, there's almost no grasshoppers in that field. They need about 20 feet just down to nothing around the edge, but the field inside was pretty much free of grasshoppers. Meanwhile, across the creek with my chemical field, the malathion dissipated in about 10 days or so, and another batch of grasshoppers came in, and we couldn't afford to spray again because it was a poor crop anyway, and it was expensive. And so we just let it go. And at harvest time, there are probably as many grasshoppers in the tank as there was grain. And it wasn't a very big year anyway. And I went to my dad after that and I said, Dad, look at this. In 2 years, we have either equaled or exceeded the chemical program here with our organic system. I'm ready to quit chemicals altogether. We're going to go cold turkey the whole farm to organic. And he said, okay. Which was quite amazing to me. And so he supported that idea. We had just been to a food show in California that previous summer, and he saw thousands of people coming by our booth saying they're thankful we're growing organic or had organic in our business. And so he knew there was a market. So that was a little bit of reassurance for him. But we didn't really know what we were doing. But we didn't make any have any big disasters. But every year was a new experiment for us, and we were fully certified within 3 years, and haven't gone back. So after our first experiments, those first 3 years, a couple of years from 86 to 88, I became a total passionate convert to regenerative organic agriculture, and we were able to lower input costs by growing mostly our inputs. I'll show you in a minute. We increased the value of our crops, now selling with organic premiums, which were 50 to sometimes 75% more than what we're getting in just the general market. We increased the agronomic and economic viability of the farm. We had operating notes, which is common to most farms, where you borrow a lot of money in the spring to pay for chemicals and seed and all that stuff. And then you hope you can pay it off with a harvest in the fall. In 3 years, we were able to eliminate that, and that had never been done before. And so the economic viability of the farm was greatly, greatly enhanced. And it made farming more fun and more interesting to me. Every year was like a new chess game, and it was great fun. So let's see, let's go on to the next one, Jason, please. So after 30 years of research on our farm, this is one of the principles I've come down, just really 2 basic principles at the basis of regenerative organic agriculture systems. The first is diversity. What we do is mimic nature. You don't see any monoculture in nature. Nature, wherever you're looking in the prairies or the deserts or the woods or the streams or the ocean, is completely diverse. And it's all made up of organisms which are taking and giving to that system to make it viable and sustainable. And so that's what we try to mimic. The diversity with rotations. We can't grow everything at once in our field, but we grow rotation. I'll show you in a second. And the second principle is really soil health, focusing on soil health. And we do that mostly by growing green manure crops, which build healthy soils. We feed the soil microbes, which then nourish the plants. And that is the basis of how this thing works. Now, let's see, go to the next slide, Jason, please. So we're looking at the value of diversity. Our cash crops are planted every second year and rotated with our soil building crops. In Montana, where we only have about 12 to 14 inches of rainfall a year, we can only grow one crop every 2 years, generally. And so the cash crop year, we're alternating between fall seeded and the spring seeded, between broadleaf, narrowleaf, late season, early season, heavy feeders, light feeders, shallow rooted, deep rooted, all those kinds of variabilities in different legumes and grains and oil seeds. And those rotations and the diversity that it brings with them break up the weed and insect and disease cycles. So hit it again, Jason, please. So that some crops also, like you see in the picture, like buckwheat, can also solubilize phosphate, and it's a big competitor against weeds. So the result is we don't need any chemical herbicides or pesticides. So there's no poisons for our land, and then no poisons on our food for our people. The next slide shows an example of a plowing down alfalfa. And so this is an example of our soil building legume crops that we also seed every other year. So we have a 9-year rotation, 5 years of cash crops, and 4 years of soil building crops, which are seeded in between those cash crops. And so if you look at the different variety of cash soil building crops. We also have that is in rotation between peas and alfalfa, yellow blossom sweet clovers, sometimes buckwheat. And so the result is we don't have any need for chemical fertilizers. Hence, we feed the soil again by using plants to nourish the biology in the soil. Okay, go to the next one, Jason, please. So this is our 9-year rotation. This is not set in stone, but it gives us, we try to follow it kind of field by field so that every year 1/9 of the farm generally is in one of these cycles, one of these years of the cycle. So we go from winter wheat, which requires the most nitrogen, gives us the biggest yield of our crops, most of our spring grain crops. We follow that with spring seeded or fall seeded peas, which are green manure. That means we cultivate them and work them into the ground. We don't plow, but we shallow cultivate with undercutting like noble blades or chisel plows and just mix them into the top of the soil. The 3rd year we'll go with barley, usually half barley, hollis barley or feed type barleys, and maybe feed peas or peas for seed. And we underseed that with yellow blossom sweet clover. So the 4th year is the yellow blossom sweet clover year, and that's a green manure year again. Then we follow that with a Kamut Coruscant wheat, which I'll talk to you about here in a few minutes. And the 6th year, we're planting peas again, but this again is for green manure and it's not for sale. We follow that with high oleic safflower. This is oil seed, which we underseed with alfalfa. So the alfalfa is seeded with it and grows. The 1st year is quite small and it's just growing under that canopy. The 8th year, we have alfalfa hay. And that really helps. If we have a good stand, it really is a good defense against perennial weeds. And we cut that for hay and sell it mostly to organic dairies. And then the 9th year, or the 10th, depending if we need to leave that alfalfa in more than 1 year or so, we'll work that alfalfa down for green manure, which is again feeding the soil. Okay, go to the next slide. So what do our detractors say? Because we're in a big minority. Well, I should say a small minority maybe, when we're into organic production. So we hear all the time that from chemical and industrial agriculture is our job is to feed the world and we will starve if we go organic. But what I have seen and what I've come to believe, our job is not to feed the world. Our job is to help the world feed itself and to learn how to feed itself. So that we're not destroying agriculture and particularly third world by sending in industrial stuff from countries like America. And what I've seen also is that the research coming out of Africa and even in India, where peasant farms, which are the majority that are feeding the world now, are converted to regenerative organic techniques that really incorporate good rotation and soil building, increase their yields by 3 or 4 times, 2 or 3 times. And it's similar to chemical yields with all that we have here in the West, but it's affordable because who's going to buy, and these peasant farmers, who's going to pay for all this stuff to prop up these yields artificially? And how about reducing food waste if we're worried about feeding the world? Almost half the food that we grow in this planet is wasted. In underdeveloped countries, it's lost before it gets to the from the farm to the factory, and in developed countries, most of it's lost after it gets to the factory or to the distributors or whatnot. And we also hear there's no future in agriculture, but to me, it's the only future that really makes sense. The industrial chemical model of agriculture has many of the wheels on that bus are coming off, and we have resistant weeds. We have all kinds of pollution problems that I'll get to in a second. That it's just not sustainable. And of course, we always hear the organic is too expensive, and my answer to that, the real cost of cheap food is completely unaffordable. Now, the next slide, I'll show you that. So the high cost of cheap food, who's really paying? Well, I'll tell you who's paying. First of all, the farmers and the workers are paying. When the normal cost of production is greater than what they receive at the farm gate for what they produce, many of them go out of business. They can't afford that. They're paying the price. They're paying part of the price of this cheap food. In the last 15 years, half of my neighbors have gone out of business. And I can't say, you can't say that that's a success story for sure. Our small communities, number two, then our small, because when the farmers go out of business, our small communities and food workers suffer because that farm base that used to support them is gone, or half of it's gone. So in the last 50 years, Big Sandy, my little town, has gone from 1,000 down to 600. And half of Main Street now is boarded up. The businesses are gone. And the food providers also are historically low salaried. So they're not really, they're paying also for this cost of cheap food. The third person, check that again, Jason, please, for me. Our Earth is paying in the form of pollutions. We have dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico due to chemical and fertilizer pollutions. It's the size of New Jersey. How big does it have to get before we really think we might be going in the wrong direction? In Iowa, the farmers' kids are not allowed to drink out of a lot of their wells because they're so contaminated with nitrates. We have glyphosate falling in the rain that falls on our farm because of the tons and tons of glyphosate that are used indiscriminately all over America. And the pollutions are enormous, and that's a huge price to pay. We have loss of organic matter because the way we farm chemically, and the increase of greenhouse gases, which and also an increase of greenhouse gases from the manufacture of nitrogen fertilizers, and these are all affecting our weather and climate change. The last one that really suffers and really pays a high price, however, is the health of our people. Right now, in this country, 60% of the entire population has at least one chronic disease. 40% have two or more. And the CDC says that most of this, 60% of the cause of this, is from poor food and poor diet. So you can't really say that's a success. And the way it's continuing, the trends are continuing to go this way, and the country will go bust. We can't afford this system. Not only we can't afford it for our own health, but financially we can. So in the end, we all pay. We're paying higher and higher taxes for all these Band-Aid effects with new pills, farm programs that subsidize declining farm income, and there's no and a real solution in sight. So what's the solution then? Go to the next slide. The regenerative organic, in my mind, is the solution. For our farms, we can reduce the cost of inputs. I already explained, increase the value of what we sell, so we have more profitability. For our communities, we increase financial support by a good farm economy. We can increase jobs and local processing and take the pressure off of overcrowded cities by keeping the people in rural America and supporting rural communities. And for our earth, we can reduce poisons and pollution and increase carbon sequestration by increasing organic matter in the soil and decrease greenhouse gas production. And finally, for the health of our people, with proper nutrient-dense food, we can reduce chronic disease significantly. And in the end, we all win. Everybody wins. In the system we have right now, only a few are winning that have control of the chemical industrial complex and the pharmaceutical, the big pharma industrial complex. Those are the guys that are winning now at the expense of most of the rest of us, where the money is being extracted out of our communities and out of our states. Okay, go to the next one. So we'll go to part two. I'm going to talk a little bit about food and health. And I've come to the conclusion that food really should be our medicine. Medicine should be our food. That's not a new idea with me. Hippocrates was teaching this 2,300 years ago. But it's now starting to catch on a little bit more and more and more, which I'm really excited about. And I think we should stop growing commodities that are focused only on yields and start growing food, which is focused on nutrition. And I'll tell you how I got to these conclusions. This is a shot with my parents in about 1968 at our first food show we went to in California. I mentioned to you, we went to sell our products from Montana Flour and Grain that I told you we had started to kind of save the farm. And my dad brought with him at that point a small bottle of ancient grain. And you'll have to, I think it's in chapter 3, you'll have to read the whole story in the book. I haven't got time to tell this whole story about where I got the seed and everything, but it was reportedly from a tomb in Egypt. Wow, that was great marketing and opportunity. And my dad showed this to everybody that went by our booth. Thousands of people went by our booth. My cousin and I were doing the business of the flour and grain. There was you see in the picture, a stone mill next to us. We were promoting stone ground flour, and it was all the rage in those days. And we ended up with our pockets full of business cards. At the end of the, 3 days, my dad had one business card and one party interested in this ancient grain. And he was so excited. We went home and we planted the whole 50 pounds that we had. So let's go to the next slide now. I'll show you what happened to that. So in 1968, we had one farm, our farm, with a half acre. We planted 50 pounds. We had zero products, we had zero income. And 30 years later, we had 300 or 250 organic farms we were contracting with, over 100,000 acres, producing over 3,500 products throughout the world, most of which were coming from Italy. And it was a multi-million-dollar project with thousands of players. So if you want to see how all that happens, there you can see chapter 5. So the reason that took off, it wasn't just a novelty that was driving this. We gave a sample of some pasta that we had made with this grain to a friend of ours in nearby Haber who had terrible wheat sensitivities. And my dad gave it to her, and I said, what did you give that to her for? You know she can't eat wheat? And my dad said, well, that's organic, isn't it? I mean, no, he's more converted than I am, you see. And she called us back in a day or so, and she said, what is this stuff? She said, when I eat it, it makes me feel better. So she'd done some muscle testing, kinesiology testing, and she felt she could try it. And when she did, she was amazed at how good she felt. And she said, you know, my sister has lots of sensitivities to food, including wheat. And could I send her some to try? And said, oh, sure, we'll send you a whole box full. So we sent her a case, and in a month or two, she called back and she said, you know, my sister talked to me the other day, and not only could she eat this, but after she ate it for several weeks, 3 or 4 weeks, she was less sensitive to other problems she was having with food. And then we thought, wow, this is like a gift from the Lord or something. This is really just not just a novelty. So then we started taking it much more serious. And let's see, the next slide I think shows what we did next. We decided to register a trademark. Now, a trademark is not doesn't prove ownership of a grain or anything you trademark. A trademark is a customer guarantee that we're promising certain things that's going to happen or are going to be provided when you buy or support this trademark. And in our case, the trademark was Kamut, because that was an ancient Egyptian word for grain, and it wasn't in public use, so we could register as a trademark. And at that time, we thought the grain still came from Egypt. I went to Cairo and I looked in the museums, and I didn't find this grain there. I found einkorn from the tombs of the pharaohs. That was surely a downer. But then when I went to Turkey, we're doing some experiments in Turkey. They said, oh, we know this grain. We call it camel's tooth or the prophet's wheat. And I said, well, okay, I know why camel's tooth makes sense. It looks like a tooth. It's big. It's about 3 times the size of regular wheat. I said, but why do you call it the prophet's wheat? And they said, does it have something to do with Muhammad? Because, you know, they're pretty Muslim there. And he said, oh, no, not that prophet. He said, you know, the one with the boat. And I said, the boat? I said, you mean Noah? Oh, yes, this is the grain that Noah brought with him on the ark. And I said, wow, that's a lot better story than my old tomb story, I told him. And so it doesn't matter what legend you want to use. There's all kinds. But anyway, that's what we're telling about now. So our trademark, our Kamut trademark, has the following guarantees: that it's always organically grown, 100% ancient Khorasan. Khorasan is a common name for this wheat. It's high in protein and minerals, and all the claims that people who use the trademark have to be supported by research. So let's go to the next slide. And I think that if that's our research. So we did a lot of research. We ended up with about 36 peer-reviewed journal articles published from 2009 to 2022. And these weren't just, you know, self-published on the internet. These were in pretty high reputable journals with worldwide distribution. And early on, we discovered that this grain increased anti-inflammatory properties in the blood. And so if it was reducing inflammation, we decided we would look at chronic disease, because all chronic disease is tied to inflammation. So we went to doing human clinical trials in Italy, mostly because in America, I couldn't find any researchers who wanted to deal with this, because nobody thought there was a problem with wheat. They said people who are having trouble with wheat, it's all in their head. But anyway, in Italy, they didn't have that idea. They wanted to know what was going on, because if Italians can't eat their pasta, you know, that's pretty serious. They don't just look for wheat-free, gluten-free. They want to know what's going on. So we started doing clinical trials with people who had irritable bowel syndrome, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, alcoholic fatty liver syndromes, fibromyalgia, and all the results were very, very consistent. The anti-inflammatory properties were the biggest difference. 30 to 45% increase in anti-inflammatory properties. Antioxidant capacity was increased. especially in diabetes, cholesterol, blood sugar, insulin resistance, all decreased. We saw increase in magnesium, zinc, and calcium levels of the blood. And so that really started to get me thinking about how important food can be as medicine and for our health. All these tests were done under double-blind crossover studies. That means that the professors, scientists carrying them out, and the people participating in it had no idea what they were eating, and which sample was which. They each were divided, the groups were divided in half. Each half ate either modern wheat products or ancient wheat products, and then for 6 weeks, and they had a washout period, and then they switched and ate the other products. So we had an internal control, and there was a very tightly well-run experiment, and we got a lot of very consistent, very good data from it. So let's go to the next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit, since wheat is my main topic and what we're focused on and how we got all this idea. What really happened to wheat then? I mean, wheat was the grain of the ancients. It's the grain that built the civilizations of Egypt, of Rome, of Babylonia, of the Greeks, and all of a sudden now, so many people have trouble eating it. Some estimates that are up to 20% of the population in America can no longer eat wheat without some kind of trouble. What has happened is that in the last 60 years or so, we've had a very aggressive breeding program to make high yields and cheap food. So cheap, abundant food is the kind of the war cry in this country, and it's been cheap. We were able to do that in breeding for reducing the height, which you can see on the left, of the old wheats down to the modern semi-dwarf wheats. The lower, shorter wheats have higher yields. They're more resistant to disease and to insects in some cases. We're using many more inputs, and they're being bred to work with those inputs that also increase yields. And of course, the bakers, they want more yields too. So on the bottom, you see different loaf volumes that are a result of different gluten. So that the stronger you make the gluten to hold more air, you can make more bread with the same amount of wheat. So imagine if you're a baker and you can sell air for the price of bread. Now, this is a very good deal. And the bakers are pretty excited about this. And so they were a very big push to increase this as much as possible. There was never any intention for any problems, malice or anything like that. I'm convinced of that. They were looking solely in a narrow focus of yields, both at the farm and in the bakery. And this more complex gluten they ended up with was something that a lot of people had trouble digesting. And they also were using fast rising yeast in the bakeries, so that the bread was rising so fast, it only had time for the yeast to digest the sugar they added to the dough. And it never started to break down or ferment the proteins or the starches or anything else in the flour, in the dough from the flour. That is in complete opposite of long fermentation, such as happens with sourdough bread, where say in 30 or 40 hours, over 90% of the gluten is completely destroyed. And so that if you eat sourdough, even overnight fermentation, a lot of the breakdown has begun, and you're eating something that's partially digested, which makes it very easy for your body to finish the job. They also have glyphosate and other chemicals, residuals on the grain that's also causing trouble with people's digestion. And so all these are adding up into a real problem with wheat that never existed before. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So that's that. So that's the importance of nutrition. Now, let me tell you another story real quick that happened to me. This is a picture of my wife and I at a food show also quite early on. And a lady came up to me in our booth and shook my hand real forcefully and looked right into my eyes. And she said, "Thank you for growing food for my family." And I thought, wow, no one's ever thanked me for growing food before, ever. I mean, wheat farmers don't go to farmers markets. We never meet our end customers. We take a truckload of wheat to the elevator and dump it in the big pit, and the elevator manager comes out taking samples, trying to find some excuse to pay us less money, finding something wrong with our wheat. Either there's rocks or they find weeds or whatever, off kernels or something. Like no one ever says thank you. That was so foreign to me. I just about fell off my chair. And but yet it had such a profound effect upon me that when I went home, I never grew another commodity again on my farm. And I tell everybody that wants to know about that, I said, I don't grow any commodities. On my farm, I grow food. I grow food that's of good quality, that is high nutrition, that helps young people grow up healthy and strong, and helps extend the lives of older people in a very satisfactory way, and nutrition and nourishes everybody in between. And that's what I grow. And I think that that really helped me to have a whole different outlook on my farm and what I was really trying to do. What was my purpose of being a farmer? So that was a big change in my outlook that really affected a lot of the way I thought. Okay, let's go on, Jason, to the next one. So let me talk about food and communities here real quick. I think it's really important now, and as we saw from the pandemic here just a couple of years ago, that we grow food and process it closer to home. I said we should eat food and that's processed closer to home. And let's support our neighbors and our communities rather than enriching industrial food and giants of the pill industry. So let's see, Jason, I just lost your picture. Are you still showing me stuff? Maybe I need to push something here. I don't know.
I believe I'm still sharing.
Okay, that's fine. I think I'm
Yep.
getting a phone call. Let me hang that up and see if it comes back. Anyway, what's the next one? You'll have to.
Let's eat food grown and processed closer to home, and then let's support our neighbors and
Yeah, and then
communities.
go to the next slide. What's that
Yep.
one? Huh, I don't know how to get back to you.
Hmm.
Okay, go ahead. Tell me what we're looking at.
Dryland vegetables and local food. Why?
Okay, so I decided that I would start about 10 or 15 years ago experimenting with dryland vegetable production. You know, irrigation water is going to be the next big fight. And if anyone thinks that's going to be fun, they got a different thing coming, because in California, if you have a decision of who's going to get the water, the farmers or the cities, well, guess who's going to win that discussion? So I think it behooves us all over the country to start growing more of our own food, even though it might cost a little more. It's there when we need it, and that's every day. That's 3 times a day. So anyway, I've been experimenting with potatoes. Is it the potato picture up now,
Yep.
Jason? Okay, and I can go to the next couple. Just flip through.
Dryland potatoes. You've got your winter squash.
Okay, and then they just show us some different crops that we've been growing, and had some good success with onions, garlic, sweet corn. And what I found, and we have about, and I wish I had thought about this before, but I did a lot of experiments with plant spacing. I found that we needed about 3 times more room to grow the plants than they do in Iowa or where they irrigate. And when I started thinking about how much rain they get, 30 or 40 inches or a little more, which is about 3 times what we get, it makes sense that the plants are needing that much more. So if you eliminate the plant population, you could imitate that situation. What I found that each plant produced just about the same number of pounds as irrigated stuff, but I only had 1/3 of the number of plants. But it's okay, we have lots of land and it doesn't cost us very much to grow this. So it was a win-win thing. Now, where are you up to now? You're showing the corn
I
picture?
even see on the sweet corn, right? You've got plants here spaced far apart, and they have double ears, right? So you're
Yeah.
spreading things out, and you're even maintaining yields in some regard.
Yes,
And
so
then
the
you've got
yield
your
per
Indian
plant,
corn.
yeah, the yield per plant is about the same. The yield per acre, however, is about 1/3 because the number of plants is reduced so much. But anyway, it can be done without irrigation, even in as dry a place as Montana. That was my take-home story. And then, let's see, well, we had the Indian corn too as an example of kind of a specialty crop. It's very high nutrition. And what's the next slide about?
You've got your peaches and your apples maybe in your orchard.
Oh,
Yep.
yeah, okay. So
Grapes.
another thing that people said we couldn't do, and you can't grow an orchard on the prairie. If you look out on the prairie, there are no trees. So of course, an orchard's not gonna survive. But we do have places on the prairie where there are trees, and they're along the rivers and along the creek bottoms, and they have 2 things that the prairie doesn't have. They have a little shelter, and they have a little more water. So I have drip irrigation on my trees that I can give them a little extra water, and I planted a shelter belt around the edges of my of my orchard, so they have protection from the harsh winds. And you can see we can grow apples. I don't know what, I think there's some cherries and
Grapes and sour
grapes.
cherries.
Yeah, and so my idea is to take like sour cherries and apple juice. The juice from both those makes a wonderful breakfast drink. It's very high in nutrition. You know, we haven't got an orange tree within 1,000 miles of Montana, so why are we drinking orange juice every? There you going back to seeing you. Back.
I'm gonna try resharing and see if it comes back for you.
Okay, I hope
Yeah.
everybody else can still see it. But yeah, there we go. So we're
Okay.
thinking about putting together a breakfast drink with that. It's even higher in nutrition than orange juice. And so this is something we could do locally and yet and support the local agriculture and have local processing. So that's the idea. We're also making vinegar out of these grapes and cherries, and it's just heavenly. I don't even bring back the balsamic vinegar from Italy anymore because it's so amazingly good. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Thank you that they came back. So the other thing that I've been focusing on is trying to revitalize rural America through adding jobs. And so we've added 2 businesses to our farm that I'll tell you about. First is the oil barn, I think is first. Go to the next slide. And the oil barn is a situation where we're cold pressing and not refining high oleic safflower oil with these presses that we got from Germany. Okay, go to the next slide now. So what we end up with is, we have some retail customers that we sell in the bottles, but we're also supplying all the oil in the kitchens at Montana State University and the University of Montana. And from the University of Montana, we were able to get the used oil back, and I was able to clean it and filter it and put it in my tractor and use it for diesel fuel substitute. Not making biodiesel, just using straight vegetable oil. You have to start the engine on diesel and get it warmed up to about 160 degrees, and then it'll run all day on your vegetable oil. So imagine if you're a farmer and you can sell your crop twice. This really helps the bottom line. And also, if you can keep all that fuel and the income and the expenses you pay for that, save that right in the community. What a great help that is to the economics of the community. So go to the next one. And the next, and this is about the last topic. So the next company we did was Montana or Big Sandy Organics, and we took our ancient wheat and our safflower oil. We roasted the wheat in the safflower oil, added a little sea salt, and we sold it as crackling kamut. So imagine now that we can sell a healthy snack and we can sell our wheat by the ounce instead of by the ton or the truckload. Also is a big help to the economics of the local farm and the community. So go to the next slide now, Jason. I think it's about, okay. This is what we've done in the last 35 years with organic sales in America. We've gone from near zero to about 6% of the total sales of food in America now is organic. And at the current annual rate of 8% growth, in the next 35 years, we can finish the job. We can be at 100%. This has solved so many of the problems that we now have. And I encourage you to go to the store every time you go shopping to put one more organic item in your basket. Be part of the solution worldwide. Okay, go to the next one. I think that's the end. My parting shots are to eat organic, grow organic, be wise, be well, be thankful, and be kind. And thank you for your attention. And have a few more minutes for any questions and discussion you want to have. I'm open for it. And thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bob. I think everybody can tell by the presentation that you put together, right, in your history, is that you're a true master of your craft, both in your farming operation as well as PowerPoint presentation, right? To be able to go off of slides there, and you're telling me what's on the slides, and I'm advancing to it. That's absolutely fantastic. So again, thank you very much. I see we got some questions in the chat. And if anybody, wants to raise their hand and come off mute, it doesn't have to be just me here. But I'll start with the bottom here. Could you talk a little bit more about profitability and market pricing on organics, and then how any of those factors have impacted premium food prices and how that trickles down through other sections of the economy? Do you foresee organic pricing and moderating in the future?
Well, I hope not. That's the last question first, because it's cheap food that's been the ruination of the country. And all the things I've talked about. So our goal is not to have cheaper food. Our goal is to have more nutritious food and better health. How can we pay for this more expensive food? Well, we can pay for it by not being so sick. If you add the cost of food and the cost of health care, or sick care, whatever you want to call it, it's remained about unchanged in the last 50 years. It's around 27, 28% of the total people's budgets. But what's changed is the percent of food and the percent that you spend on healthcare. We've gone from 50, 60 years ago to about 18% of our income was spent on food. Now it's around 7 or 8, and just the opposite with healthcare. And so the two of those are linked together inseparably. And so you can really choose which one you want to contribute to. If you focus just on the cost of food without considering the cost of health, you're only going to get half the answer, and you're going to end up going down the wrong path. Now, the question that where'd my chat go here? The questions about markets and whatnot. If you're a farmer, I really caution people to have 2 or 3 markets lined up. I mean, we're still small unless you're growing something very standard, like wheat or corn or something that there's lots of markets for. If you're doing some specialty crops, be sure you have a couple places you can go with that and not get left holding the bag, because a lot of smaller companies sometimes they'll get in trouble from one year to the next, and they can't be there, or things change, and you have to have some flexibility in your marketing. And that's the other advantage of having many different crops. If something goes haywire, it doesn't sink the whole farm, because it's only a small percent of your whole farm as income. So that's another safeguard that regenerative organic inherently has in its system if you're following it correctly. What else?
I see 2 questions have been asked about pests and controls and any issues in your organic system. Have you had any problems or hiccups?
That's a good question. Usually, you got a couple of advantages going for you with organic. One is the diversity, so the plants aren't coming in, or the pests aren't coming in and wiping something completely out, because everything is susceptible if one thing's susceptible. So if you have diversity, and even with the same crop, you could have diversity by growing land races and seed stock that's not so pure, but is made up of different variables of different varieties or different species, even within a wheat crop or a corn crop or vegetable crop or anything. When you have that kind of variability, diversity, you normally also have diversity in insect attack and in the diseases and also the weeds that go with them, and that will help you. You can't skip. You can't be successful in farming organically just by removing chemicals. That's going to be this recipe for disaster. You have to have a whole program that substitutes the need for those chemicals by having healthy soils and lots of diversity, so that your plants are protected by different plants, and they're not all the same.
I see 2 questions on tillage practices. Have you tried no-till? Why or why not? And then there was, I think, another one just asking about tillage practices that you use on those green manure crops.
Okay, normally it kind of depends what kind of crop it is. If we've got a 6 feet tall sweet clover, I'd use a heavy disc on that, and that disc will not incorporate all of that green matter into the organic matter into the soil. It leaves about a 4 or 5 or 6 inch mulch on top, which I don't have to till then for the whole rest of the summer, which is my favorite. That's really nice. I have experimented with some rolling and some crimping, and I haven't had very good luck with it. That they've had further east, or maybe where it's wetter. I don't know exactly why. I'm not giving up, but I haven't been successful. I've tried some other ideas of raising green manures, planting them late in the summer or early fall, and letting them winter kill. But then I've had problems with perennial or winter annual weeds that survive the winter, and they come up, and then I have to till them anyway. So I'm still working on ideas for reduced tillage or no tillage, but I haven't really had something that's been successful.
Yeah. And we'll pivot right into the next question, since you're talking about soil health and how the tillage practices work with that. Question here, from your experience, how can we remedy soils that are already polluted by agrochemicals? Maybe talk about your transition on your own farm to organics.
Well, that's a really good question. And the best way to do it is to bring your soil back to life so it can take care of itself and break down those poisons and things that have killed in the past. But for the healthy soil, you can do that. It'll take a little time, and you can see it happening, but don't give up on it. We had when we were still using chemicals, we had a section that was completely sterilized because of the type of, it was a sandy knoll, and it was completely sterilized, so nothing grew there for 3 or 4 years until it started to come back to life again. So some of these things might take a little longer, but a healthy soil, just the ending of, so you got two things. You have to end the bad things, end the bad inputs, and then increase the good inputs. So you have to have both of those. People have also incorporated cattle, which speeds up the whole process, I think, and putting some fields into grass and grazing them for a year or two also can be a factor to help revitalize in a quicker way if you've got some really tough situations.
Yeah. With some of that transition and some of your green manure, there's a question here on when relying on legumes and manure for nitrogen, is it potassium deficiency a concern?
That's a good question too. We have both phosphate and potassium in our soils at a pretty high level, and our yields are quite low anyway because of rainfall. And so it is a mining for sure. If you haul something away and don't replace it, at some point it's going to be gone. But we haven't seen a decrease that's significant yet, or one that is causing trouble for us in some area. I know that's probably not true all over the country, but at least in our area, that's what we're seeing so far. I think the vitality of the plants in the soil are able to solubilize those minerals at a higher rate than without that vitality, so that we are seeing that we don't need as much in the soil as the university projections or recommendations would be, and still getting the same result as far as nutrition in our plants. And I think that some of that's due to the microbiology that's aiding us in the soil.
Okay. I'm going to combine two questions here. So the first one, just real quick, what's the average rainfall in Big Sandy?
Around 12 to 13 inches a year.
Okay. And then with that, especially where I'm at, I'm located in the Southwest US, and water resources are always a hot topic.
Oh, yeah.
You're dryland farming, tell us a little bit about that. Water resources, what's that look like for the future?
Well, that's really a good question. What we're seeing with climate change, I don't really refer to this, what's going on as climate change, as much as I refer to it as climate chaos, because that's what I'm seeing. It's just chaotic. It's hotter and drier or wetter or colder. And it's, we used to have kind of an 11-year cycle between wet and dry years, or wet years. I mean, we have a dry period in between two wet cycles in about 11 years. We don't see that anymore. We see a very wet year followed by a very dry year, or vice versa. And there again, if you can increase the water holding capacity of your soil, the tilth of your soil. So if you're getting a deluge, which we're getting more now, of heavier rain in a quicker period of time, and yet if that runs off your field, you're really losing a lot of resource. If you can salvage that water by having soil that allows it to soak in very rapidly, that's a huge asset that you can capture. So that can help modify, or not modify, but help you respond to some of this climate chaos and still have some chances for success.
Mm-hmm. Makes your farming operation a little bit more resilient to respond to the extremes.
Diversity begets stability, and part of that stability is from resiliency.
Excellent. We're gonna have a couple more questions in the chat, but with 1 minute left to go, I just want to thank everybody for participating in today's member hour. There is a plug for the next member hour on March 15th at 1 p.m. It's a highlight in producing sugar in Louisiana. But I'm gonna keep going here. There's a couple more questions in the chat, but thank you for attendance. If you have to drop off for your next meeting, feel free. Bob, the next one here, what type of soil testing are you doing on your farm? And there's another question on what type of soil is predominant on your farm?
We also have a sandy loam, but we do have pockets. We're in a northern Montana is covered by glaciers, so most of our soil we can thank Canada for, because it was transported and deposited down. So there's a lot of variability even in a single field because of that, because of the glacier action of the glaciers. But generally, it's a sandy loam. I tried to do in the past. I've rented out my farm now in my quest to really involve the next generation and let them have a turn. But when I was farming, I would generally do just basic soil analysis. Not that I could do much about it, but I could see what the trends were. And that was helpful for me. I didn't want to go into, and this is just a kind of arbitrary decision on my mind. I didn't want to substitute a bag of organic inputs for a bag of chemical inputs. I wanted to see how much we could do by just nurturing the soil with our own production and raising soil building crops. That worked pretty well here in the upper Great Plains, where we're only growing a crop every 2 years anyway. And I found if I was terminating my soil building crops by the middle of June, I was able to save enough water that there's no drag on the yields, and I was able to grow a crop to feed my soil every other year by that. Now I'm really interested in working with other systems or experimenting with those. I want to create a regenerative organic education and health institute in the middle of my farm, and I'd like to compare different systems that people are working with, particularly coming from regenerative experiments that people are excited about, and focusing on incorporating an animal component into their farm and some of those sorts of things. So I haven't gotten the chance to get into that yet, but that's where I'm intending to go.
Yeah. I then saw one other question on, maybe in line with some of the expansion that you've talked about. There was a question that came in towards the end of the slide deck when you started talking about safflower oil and some of the alternative fuels. Have you explored any alternative energy sources? Do you have solar on your farm, wind, electrics? I mean, have you transitioned at all to EVs? I think there's just some curiosity there.
Okay, well, I was involved with some actually relatives and friends of mine from Germany to develop Montana's first wind farm about 20 years ago. But I haven't got it into my house yet. But now, so I'm really enthused about that, because we have so much wind in Montana that the last time it quit blowing, half of the buildings fell down. So I told people it's a good place to come for wind. But now the solar has become so cost competitive that it's leaving a little bit of the wind behind as far as individual applications. And I'm really hoping the next year or so I can get, I wanted to have my oil operation run by solar, so the whole thing could be completely renewable, but I never reached that goal before it was sold last September. But now I'm working on I've dug a subterranean greenhouse where I'm using thermal heat from the ground, 10 feet under the ground, that brings in 50-degree air to keep the greenhouse from freezing in the winter. And I'm really excited about that. I want to incorporate a little more of experiments on that and growing our own food and incorporating particularly soil or solar power in conjunction with that.
There was a question that came in, Bob, on AI, artificial intelligence, and some of the future of organic farming. Do you see a place, a need, right, for AI and decision making, processing data, looking at historic trends for the future? Do you see a need for data in organics?
Oh yes, I think we need all the help we can get.
Yeah.
And we're working with a couple of researchers from Montana State right now on that very thing, and trying to see if we can fine tune our seeding, for example, compared to soil types and previous yield histories. That's all in this AI type of data analysis. And so I think that we have to take every advantage we can to grow the best food that we can. And I think that I don't put anything off the table as far as trying it out, and particularly if it can, well, it can't decrease the quality of our food, the nutrition of our food, but if it can enhance it or increase the yields without decreasing the nutrition, I'm all for that.
Excellent. I kind of jumped around the chat a little bit, but I'm just scanning and I don't see any new questions. Is there anybody that wants to drop one in the chat or come off mute and ask Bob directly?
Jason, do you mind if I do? This is Darren.
Yeah, go ahead, Darren.
Bob, I put in the chat to excellent, really an excellent presentation. A lot there for technical folks and non-technical folks. Hey, curious a bit, I don't know much about this area, but I've heard some raise concern, though, a bit about truth in advertising. Are you running into labeling issues and perhaps some folks out there that might claim to be things they're not, and what might be some solutions?
Well, that's a very good question. Answer to that goes back to about the beginning of time, I'd say. You know, that's one of the reasons we went to Congress to get an organic definition in the first place, is because people were, many states had definitions, many did not. And if there wasn't a state definition, you could call it anything you wanted to. That's one of my big frustrations with this regenerative movement now. There's no legal definition, and it can be almost anything you want it to be. And it can be a little bit of Roundup, a little bit of GMOs, and a lot of soil building, but it's all over the board. And people sometimes are, if they're not being completely misled, they're certainly allowed to think that they're getting more than they're paying for, or getting than they're expecting. And that's always been a challenge in labeling. With our Kamut project now, we have people that are selling Coruscant wheat and saying, kind of on the side, well, this is just as good as Kamut, but they don't have a guarantee program with it. So that's always a challenge. You get what you pay for, and you should ask the hard questions. If you see people using slippery words like natural and all this kind of stuff, I always encourage people to ask more questions and get some definition of what they're really talking about. When local is another one. We see local on a label and it's come from, South Pacific or something, for heaven's sakes. I don't know if in the same side of the earth, is that kind of local? I don't know, but it's really a challenge. And when you don't have prescribed definitions, then you don't really know what you're talking about with some of those kind of words like local and regenerative and natural and all that kind of stuff. That's a challenge, just a big, and with organic, if you're fraudulent, you can go to jail. Not everybody gets caught, but there's enough getting caught that it's quite a big deterrent, and people can generally have good faith that label means something, because if they're caught cheating, penalties can be pretty high. So that gives you some level of confidence in that. Did that answer your question?
Excellent, thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions anybody wants to come off chat for?
I see somebody was in the chat asked about the 9-year rotation was just in a section of the whole farm, but we tried to do it in the whole farm. Of course, our pasture didn't include that. The permanent pasture wasn't part of that, but everything that was cultivated was.
Bob, I'll tee you up with 2 questions if there's no other people that want to come off chat to get their questions and transition out. So again, thank you so much for taking the time today. 2 questions, kind of part A, right, is transitioning to the next generation. You had mentioned, you kind of wanted to give next generation a try with some of your farm renting out. I'd like to just maybe speak to that a little bit and, maybe tie back to how, you got started, right, and diversified the farming practices to expand it. And then two, we mentioned before people joined, you know, your retirement, what's that look like for you? What's next, you know, in the second half of your career?
Well, the second half of my career is going to be focused on my research and health and education institute that I mentioned to you. I had 5 kids, but I didn't have any of them show up at the farm gate wanting to take over the farm. So I'm going to take 600 or 700 acres out of the middle and create this research institute. And that'll be for hopefully lots of generations and for help lots of people. But as far as the next generation, I think it's really important to make as many opportunities for transition as possible, to try to pair up people who are retiring without possibility of passing on the farm to their next generation of their own family, to hook up with people who want to farm instead of just selling out to the neighbors. This isn't really a good direction just for farmers and ranchers just to get bigger and bigger and bigger, buying up all their neighbors pretty soon. They have no neighbors, and that's really not a very healthy thing either. It would be much better if we could keep those farms diversified and smaller and supporting more families. And even bigger farms, if they wanted to bring back their sons or daughters rather than buy the neighbors out so they could afford to bring them back, why not we look at helping them transition into additional enterprises that brings additional income onto that farm, like a vegetable or orchard enterprise in a wheat growing country or grain growing area. Those kinds of things, you could have a lot of diversification, bring in a lot of extra money that could support a family. I think those are really important to have ways to pair up, because people who have land with people who want to farm land, because most people can't just go out and buy it. It's so enormously expensive to get started that way. But there's more and more opportunities for renting, and I'd really prefer seeing that rather than being sold and consolidated more and more.
Absolutely. I see 45 people have hung around
Wow.
through this Q&A, so that is just great. I see two more questions came in while we were wrapping up that one, so I'll throw them to you. Do you have a beef herd or anything renting out your pasture land? We didn't hear you talk about cattle.
No, we didn't get into that.
Yeah.
We had a 50 cow calf grade herd all the time I was growing up, and until about 1985 or 86, when I started going to food shows in the winter. And my wife informed me very kindly that she wasn't going to be here to feed the cows and take care of them or calve them out or anything else. So I had to make a choice, and well, we didn't have help. We weren't big enough to have full-time help during the winter. We had part-time help in the summer. So I leased out my pasture and sold my cows, and now the folks that are renting from me are interested in getting some back. And with my experimental research institute that I want to put together, I certainly will have an animal, a large and small animal component to that, including cows. I think that it can be an important part of the whole system. And if you're, well, and most places can grow grass, if you can rotate that around with animals, just further diversification, and that's always a good thing.
Yeah. And with that green fertilizer, there was one more question that came in on, would you clarify the chance of using greenly prepared fertilizers such as ammonium sulfate and struvite in a way that does not hurt the organic farming concept?
So you're talking about fertilizers that are organically approved. Is that?
Yeah. Yep. I think that's where they're headed. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you're growing strawberries, if you're growing an extremely high value crop where it doesn't really make sense maybe to rotate the land the way we're doing it, then I think the more you can make yourself, I think the better off you are. So if you're in a high production area and have access to manure, composting, if you can make your own compost, that's huge. I think that's a huge asset, and compost teas and all those sorts of things. We can't do that on 3,000 acres or 4,000 acres. That's just not in the cards for us. But if you have 10 acres and you're doing asparagus or berries or something, a really high value crop, you can do that, and you can have, it doesn't take a lot of room, and you can make your own. I would encourage people not to become reliant on purchase inputs. I mean, it's fine for give me a start or, you know, a little supplement, but I would hesitate to encourage people to have that as the majority of their nutrition profile. I would look for ways to create it yourself, or at least very close by locally, and work with people that are maybe focusing on that in that aspect, and to work with them if they're in your neighborhood.
I think you hit on a point there, right? That wraps this up really nicely. Is don't rely on purchase inputs, right? You throughout your career, you've never accepted the status quo or the way we've always done it, and you've looked at how do I do it myself or do it cheaper. And I think that's a really nice wrap up question. Again, thank you, Bob, for the time today, and thank you for the participants. You know, I see 40 people hung on 15 minutes, you know, through after the member hour was done. So
Well, I
Bob,
wish I could
any
thank you all
parting words?
personally. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
I see a lot of thank yous and just really positive comments in the chat. So again, thanks so much, Bob, for taking the time to talk with all of us today.
No, you're sure welcome. And anyone gets close to us in North Central Montana, my door is open. So be glad to have you visit anytime.
Okay, with that, we will end this member hour. Thank you everybody for attending, and Bob, I'll be in touch here in a couple minutes.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.